Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first afternoon session, if you're on the East Coast anyway, our first afternoon session of CME Palooza. Thanks for continuing to join us. We are actually short one panel member at this moment, but we are going to hope that Patty is able to join us, so we're going to stick to our schedule, and hopefully she can join when she is able to log in. So I'm going to give a quick intro as before, and then I'll turn things over to John. So this is our What Do Supporters Do with Outcomes Data session, sponsored by IMEDX, moderated by John Ruggiero. As before, our sponsors, who we're going to give a big thank you to, our gold sponsor, Genentech, silver sponsors, IMEDX, MedPage Today, bronze sponsors, CMEology, Educational Measures, Highmark CE, Impact Education, MedEdicus, Red Med Ed, and the company that I apologize, I still haven't said right yet. I'm going to try it again, Vivacity Consulting. And we'll see if I got it right on my third attempt at it. Three ways that you can ask questions, and we really do encourage you to ask questions. All the sessions so far have had pretty good interaction. So the three ways you can do it is to use our MedPage Today text line, which is 267-666-0CME. You can also click on this Google Plus Q&A link, which is located at the bottom of each video. You do need to have a Google Plus account in order to log in. And then you can also tweet us a question using the CME Palooza hashtag. Our speaker disclosure, just keep in mind that all opinions, discussions, and or conclusions expressed by everyone do not represent the endorsement by or position of their employers, parent company, or affiliates. And lastly, this is our panel for today. Our moderator today is John Ruggiero. John is the Group Manager for Medical Education and Research Strategy at Genentech, and it's responsible for leading the U.S.-affiliated Medical Education Manager team. Since 2006, he has also served as an adjunct professor for biostatistics, epidemiology, and research methods at Drexel's University College of Nursing and Health Professions in Philadelphia. So John, I'm going to turn things over to you.
Great, thank you, Derek, and thank you for the opportunity to be part of this session. Looking very forward to working with my colleagues here on the panel to talk about outcomes and what supporters do with that. I can absolutely tell you that I've received some feedback from the provider community who were eagerly anticipating this session as well, because having been a former provider, I can certainly tell you that the provider community often relies on the expertise of the supporter community to help inform them on how to enhance outcomes in a way that's going to better meet the expectations and the benefits for what the senior leadership and supporters communities will expect. So I'm looking forward to the dialogue and the expertise that we have here on the panel. I'm going to have the panelists introduce themselves. I would not do it justice if I tried to do that on my own. So let's start with Maureen. Maureen Doyle-Scarf, please.
Hi, John. Thank you. And good afternoon or good morning, or I guess there's some Europeans maybe on. Good evening to everyone. My name is Maureen Doyle-Scarf. I am the Senior Director and Team Lead for the Independent Grants for Learning and Change team at Pfizer. I have been working in CME, CPD, Learning and Change for nearly 25 years. Most of those years have been spent on the commercial support side, so working in industry in the pharmaceutical arena. Very active in the profession, have sat on many boards, including the Alliance. I'm a board member of the NCCME, the certification and credential for CPD professionals. And I am currently a doctoral student, about 2/3 of the way through getting a PhD in higher education administration. And my dissertation is actually looking at female faculty in allopathic schools of medicine and how mentoring supports their career pathway. So
that is quite impressive. That's quite impressive. Thank you. Griselda.
Don't be too impressed. A lot of work. There's a lot going on. I can't say no. That's what my friend said.
Well, hey, that's a great thing, though. Griselda, would you like to go ahead and introduce yourself, please?
Certainly. My name is Griselda Butler. Good day to everyone. I am the Manager for Professional Education at Otsuka America Pharmaceutical, Inc. I've been on the commercial support side for about 2.5 years, a little more. Prior to that, I spent the first 15.5 years of my career on the provider side, both in nonprofit institutions and for-profit medical education companies, also working in trauma hospitals. I have to say that this is an exciting opportunity for me. I have been more engaged and more involved with my community at this level over the last 3 or so years, and I'm really excited about that. That's something that really jazzes me up, and this topic is of particular interest because I remember being a provider and wondering constantly, what are they doing with these reports that I'm putting together? So it's really exciting for me to be able to share with you what I actually do with the data that I get here at OTSCOP.
And a great segue into the statement that I'm about to make, which is, yes, we do something with all of those reports that you send. I do think that that is a realistic question that Griselda just provided to us. There are a lot of questions in the provider community about the outcomes data reports that are sent to us and how we interpret those and how we use them in a disparate way to really analyze in a summarized way the points that need to be made to our senior leadership within our departments as well as within our organizations. The one thing that I do want to mention before getting started, Patty Jasek is hopefully going to join us as well if she's able to connect amidst some of the technical difficulties. Just so that everybody knows, Patty, we're going to try to do this very seamless if she joins. Patty is the Director for the Independent Medical Education and Advocacy Development Department over at Astellas in the Chicago area, so hopefully she can join us then. As we get started, one of the interesting things that came up when we all met as a group discussing how we were going to address each one of these questions is we throw around the term outcomes quite often in our educational industry, and sometimes the word means different things to different organizations. And I'd like to start with Maureen in addressing this specific question. How does your organization define outcomes? Maureen.
So yes, I'm glad we're clarifying this and we're defining it because it can get confusing, and the grants program that I have the privilege of leading really looks at this notion of outcomes in an advanced way. Let me put it that way, not necessarily different. But we define outcomes, meaning how do we define success and how those outcomes represent the success of the work that my team engages in, that my team supports, that the provider community actually facilitates and implements. We define outcomes at the patient level. Moore's levels notwithstanding, every single project that we support that is under our Track 1 or Learning and Change avenue actually has as an endpoint, or seeks to have as an endpoint, a measurable change in practice and patient care. So that's how we define outcomes. When I'm talking about outcomes reports, when I'm talking about outcomes to our CEO and his leadership team and all of the other stakeholders that we share these data with, we are sharing patient-level outcomes, aggregated, but still patient-level outcomes in terms of the work that we support.
That's a great comment to make, Maureen. And just a question about that. I wonder whether or not when we start talking about advanced outcomes, which I can absolutely tell you are much more relevant for what we need for our senior leadership as well in our organization, do you wind up doing anything with the data that shows level 1, level 2, or even level 3 from the Moore's Pyramid? Does that help in any kind of way?
Only in terms of quantitative data that might serve as a as a foundation or a baseline for the work that we do. I mean, in terms of trying to carve this out in a very simplistic fashion, our entire grants program strategy focuses on 2 different problems that one may be trying to solve, either a gap in knowledge or a gap in practice. And one, in many cases, precedes the other. I say too often that it's, you can't ignore the knowledge piece because you can't expect someone to translate knowledge into practice if they don't have it in the first place. So we very specifically, and we've retooled and evolved our entire platform to put more of an emphasis on the knowledge gap strategy piece for certain areas. And so, although I got to tell you, quite frankly, level 1, level 2 is I don't care about that. I mean, whether or not someone is satisfied, at the very least, if we're supporting something in terms of a knowledge gap, we would like to see data that shows that, in fact, that gap has closed.
Sure.
So whether it's pre-post, bare minimum, that would be our expectation. But I'll tell you, that's not. Those are, like I said, quantitative numbers. We can talk about how many learners we've reached, and we can talk about how many learners actually did learn something vis-a-vis those data that the provider community supplies us with. But I'm living. It's be careful what we're living the be careful what you wish for, because our internal stakeholder group now, just like us, looks at those data and says, so what? You've taught us to ask the question, okay, so these people have learned, well, what are they doing with that information now? Are they actually applying it to practice, and is that improving patient care? So the bar has been raised for us. We did it to ourselves, and it's a welcome challenge on our part. That's why, but the data on that lower part of the pyramid of more scale is, it's sort of, okay, yeah, it's there, but that's not really telling a story.
That's a really good response. I do agree with everything you just said. Griselda, outcomes. What does the term mean to you in your organization? And thinking about all the things that Maureen just shared, any reflection on that as well?
Absolutely. So I think it's important to note that our organizations are at different stages. Right now, when I came on board, we weren't at the level of sophistication that I would have wanted us to be at in terms of what our expectations were as far as outcomes were concerned. And I've worked pretty diligently over the last 2.5 years to get us to a point where we're looking at the data at a higher level. We're looking at it in a more sophisticated way. We're not at the level that Maureen is at, but one of the things that I think is a key differentiator is our therapy areas. So we have some significant therapy areas where there is a baseline knowledge gap, where there's absolutely not enough information or evidence to show that clinicians understand the disease state and or know exactly what it is that they should be doing from a clinical standpoint for the various etiologies in which the disease presents itself. And so we've had to take a step back and say we need to look at level 3 for these folks, because they've got to establish the baseline before we can move them along to next, where we also know that there's just a lack of understanding of what the disease even is or how it's manifested. So that does inform what we're looking at when we're looking at outcomes. Outcomes to us means that deliverable that demonstrates to us that the education was designed and was executed and implemented and accomplished what it said it would, and if it did not, that gap where it was not accomplished could be explained and elucidated to help us refine what we choose to support in the future, and to help the provider also to refine what they choose to develop in the future. As far as what Maureen mentioned in terms of how we're educating internally, I have to say I'm making small gains with my group in terms of helping them to understand things from the perspective that they live in. They have a different functional area and their disciplines are different. My medical directors care very much about the science behind the needs assessment. And so I let them focus on that, and then I come in and bring the additional information for them that helps to elucidate why that science matches up with the objectives, matches up with the gaps that were identified, matches up with the educational methodology and the proposed outcomes. And that's really my role as a consultant to my review committee.
That's great feedback. I think that there is something that you said that I would like to capture and I want to reinforce with everyone who's listening today, and hopefully throughout the entire educational industry eventually. We talk about enhancing outcomes models. We talk about enhancing our educational platforms. We talk about quality improvement being integrated into education. But again, I think that there's one moment in time that we must never forget, that everything starts with a knowledge base, a foundational base. And depending on some therapeutic areas, as you pointed out, Griselda, there are times where the necessary endpoint is some type of foundational knowledge base, and I think it was really great that you brought that up as well. So Patty, welcome to the session, and I'm so glad that you could join us. The question, we did introduce you, Patty, I hope that's okay, but we're asking the question about outcomes, what the term means to you and your organization. Any thoughts there?
I would reiterate what I've heard both Maureen and Griselda say, and in addition, one of the things that I think happens is that the outcomes are very specific related to the disease state, which is a lot of the discussion that Griselda had. So part of it I find really intriguing is that in oncology, which is an area that we focus with at Stellus, it's really always returning to baseline because there's always new information that's changing almost on a daily basis. And so you're trying to figure out those that need the basic new information and those that have already have that foundational piece, and where do they tie in the new knowledge, the new drugs, the new protocols, the new approaches to patient care. So it's a juggle and almost sitting on the fence to say that you could do 3 and 4, but really getting to where you can measure impact on community or on a basic. It's really hard when there are very few gold standards of treatment for oncology care. Much easier when you get to screening, much easier when you get to palliative care or to components of patient engagement or shared decision. But from a physician knowledge or a healthcare knowledge perspective, it does become much more complicated in terms of really seeking higher level outcomes. We've also struggled a bit, as I've heard both Maureen and Griselda mention about, like, once we've taught all of our colleagues about outcomes and what they can expect about identifying an educational strategy for a specific therapeutic area, looking at who's our target audience, has it changed, has it moved, are there new entities? For example, lung cancer is a really good example where we really focused on medical oncologists, we focused on nurses, PAs, and Ps. But now recently, with all the changes in biomarkers, it's important to also focus not only on getting the test ordered, but on what the pathologist is reading from those biomarker tests and what it means from a pathology perspective. And so it's really looking at that whole continuum and seeing and shifting as changes occur within science to understand, are we still targeting the right target audience for the basic fundamental information that's necessary to improve care.
That's some really great feedback, because I think it's a perfect segue into the second question that I want to ask. Patty just mentioned some of these new entities, some of these new internal stakeholders as well, if you will, if I can have the liberty to go beyond from what Patty was saying. Maureen talked about teaching her colleagues about enhancing the outcomes levels, and they now have a greater expectation on us on what that all means, and that's part of the natural process of learning, so it's great that we've been able to do that in our industry. Griselda talked about being a consultant to her medical team and also providing some educational adult learning expertise onto what they should be seeking when reviewing grants. So the question that I have for each of you, maybe let's start with Patty, if you're ready to do this. To which internal stakeholders do you present your outcomes data to? Or the provider's outcomes data to, excuse me.
Well, we would do it across all stakeholders at our company, and it depends on what we're really looking for. For example, when a provider wants to come in and present their information, we primarily will keep that more within the medical affairs domain unless we feel that there's a broad impact that can overlap with our colleagues from the marketing domain and a broader piece. So that includes our health economics research group, it includes our medical information, it includes our call center, it includes our MSL team, it includes our medical directors, and also our ISR team as well, so that we really look at the multitude of players within the medical affairs space. We will then talk about what's important from this data outcomes that has been provided to us by the provider that commercial needs to know. Are there gaps that haven't been identified before in our joint plan, in our strategy, and what is it that we can do about these? So we intend to identify those continuing barriers or those insights that we glimmer from the outcomes reports, and then we'll pass those on to certain parts of the outcomes presentation. I think we all know that we get a lot of data when we get outcomes, and we always are seeking more of an executive summary, that, like, what's the big aha? What happened? Did you do what you said you were going to do? What's the big aha? And what are those insights that we then need to think about and work on to the next level? And what does it mean then for our educational strategy? And do we need to revise and refine it?
So, Patty, you identified the big aha, with some of those key stakeholders within the organization. I would have to say, too, and I'm just the moderator here, I'm not the panel, but I very much find similarities between what you do and what I've done in the past as well. Griselda, you mentioned being a consultant to your medical team. Do you go beyond the consultation of the grant review and wind up speaking with those same people to demonstrate the outcomes that have been provided to you? Thoughts there?
I do, and I'm lucky in that I have access to my global medical affairs team as well as my U.S. medical affairs team. I do a lot of presentations to my MSLs on their monthly calls. I also seek out opportunities to speak with our global medical affairs team about what they're doing, because they're more on the R&D side, so they're doing research and development. And since I'm also responsible for research trials, investigator-sponsored research trials, as well as government affairs charitable contributions, I also speak to our government affairs group and some of our managed markets folks so that they can understand how what we do is very interconnected, that there's a strategy that rolls up to the corporate overall strategy is important for us to sort of reinforce because we are a small team within medical affairs overall, and sometimes it's about just reinforcing and reiterating our value to our internal stakeholders. And so I do get that opportunity. And when I do, I emphasize small pieces of information, short stories that help to sort of reinforce the fact that, yes, what we're doing is in alignment with the overall medical strategy, which rolls up to the overall corporate strategy. Here's what you're doing out in the field from a MSL point of view and the questions you're hearing, and here's what we're getting in terms of answers from the outcomes our providers are giving us. Really making that connection with our HERA group in terms of some of the PE education that we've done and the pharmacoeconomic focus. They're not even aware sometimes that we're supporting education of that ilk. So I think it's so important that I get an opportunity to jump in when I can, and I keep it short and I keep it sweet and I make it specific to my audience. And I think they value that. They've come back to me to tell me they value it, and as a result, I'm working on several key internal projects for investigational agents right now, which is great for me, but it's also good to promote my team internally.
Sure. So we heard about the big aha moment. We heard about interconnectivity. One thing that seemed to surface in both of those responses, Maureen, and maybe you can respond to this and then also respond further to the same question I asked the other two. There was not only the interconnectivity, but being able to show corporate or commercial that there's some type of corporate business objective being addressed through the educational outcomes that we receive. When I speak with providers, sometimes, and having been a former provider, it's hard to really swallow that. Can education still be fair and balanced and still match to the corporate need? Do you have any thoughts there? And can you explain a little bit further to the providers what we mean when we say that?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I will first off by saying and remind everyone that none of us and any of our peers in the industry community work for foundations or are running philanthropic entities, maybe with respect to healthcare charitables, but that's not what we're talking about today. The key to our strategy, and I think that probably all of my colleagues would agree to this, not beyond Pfizer, is that intersection between Pfizer's, in my case, business interests and the public health. So it's if it's just all about Pfizer, then my team isn't going to get involved in it. But if there's an opportunity for us to find that intersection and recognize that through our grants efforts, that in fact care can be improved, public health can be improved, and at the same time that's not a bad thing for Pfizer, then everyone wins. And I'll use Patty brought up the lung cancer. Let me use a specific example. We too are involved in that, and the whole notion of molecular testing is a big issue. When you look at baselines in many of the community oncology centers, a lot of it is, there's a lot of barriers to genetic testing. It's not just a cost barrier, but there's barriers with respect to the care team across the continuum that Patty referenced. Our entire strategy in that space is not to educate any of the care team on lung cancer, on diagnosing lung cancer, on managing lung cancer patients, any of that. Our entire strategy is actually increasing the molecular testing of patients who should be tested because there in fact are agents that will potentially, at least extend their life, enhance their quality of life, maybe save their life. So when you start to look at, and when we are getting data in, which is phenomenal data when you look at baseline in terms of these projects, and I want to make sure that I note for everyone here that these strategies are not 100% educational. Education is rarely going to get to the kind of changes that I'm talking about here, which is going from 28% molecular testing of a patient population to 100% testing. There's a huge educational strategy, but there are also, talk about interprofessional strategies that are involved in terms of putting the pathologist in the shoes of the surgeon, in the shoes of the clinical oncologist, and all of those different people that have to understand how each of their actions is tied to the next action in terms of that care team. So this notion of at the end of the day, if genetic testing is increased, if molecular testing is increased, then the lung cancer patients who are identified as being appropriate patients for a solution, and that solution happens to be a Pfizer product, then that's great for the patient, and that's good for Pfizer as well. And the flip side of that, if it is determined that the Pfizer product is not the right solution for the patient, then that is also good for Pfizer and good for the patient. So that's an example of how those pieces intersect, and those are the kind of data that we're getting in that particular clinical area that we're able to feed throughout the entire organization to all manner of stakeholders, both on the commercial as well as the medical side. Because at the end of the day, all of those people are trying to increase genetic testing because it's the right thing to do for the patient. And if we have been able to uncover a specific strategy through the support that our team offers through our grants program, and that strategy could be duplicated in other community oncology centers or institutions, that's a very, very good thing. And a lot of people in the company are interested in that. So
maybe that's incredibly helpful, Maureen. Maybe speaking about, or going beyond just a lot of people in the company, because there's so many tactics that go into the solution, if you will, beyond just education as one tactic. Who are your internal stakeholders that are interested in hearing your outcomes presentations?
So everyone from anyone in medical, the list, Patty, everyone she was ticking off on her list is the same people on my list. It's a big group of people. Medical affairs, all of our field-based medical colleagues, commercial colleagues, health outcomes colleagues, you name it. Individuals who are also looking to, in their way, through their perspective, through their channel and their job and expertise, are trying to do something similar. The key to all of this is also in this economy and this world that we all now are faced to live in with diminishing resources. The idea of not making sure that all of our initiatives and strategies aren't complementary in an appropriate, compliant, legal capacity. Shame on us. So the more we can facilitate, Griselda's comment about making it short, making it sweet, and making it relevant, I can't agree with that more. Because I can't. My team we have multiple. A framework that has multiple components in terms of that outreach. We have quarterly updates where anybody is they're on webinars. Anybody is invited to come and listen to their section, on lung cancer and molecular testing and the results that we've been able to uncover. We also work individually and schedule our own either quarterly, and sometimes they're more often depending on the clinical area and how rapidly things are changing. We will have a smaller group of individuals where we'll provide the data. I know we're going to get to that, but that, from my vantage point, is the biggest challenge, is how do you take what comes in and turn it into that, that relevant but short and sweet story that is going to be useful to anybody that wants to hear the story.
Right. Awesome transition. And I think that that's the reason why, and I want to reinforce with those who are listening today, the reason why the previous question was asked is because we have a responsibility on the supporter side to help translate or interpret some of this information that we receive to make it relevant to the appropriate audiences that we're presenting to. At the same time, there are ways that I believe educational providers can consider the different types of audience we present to and think about that as they plan for or at least develop their outcomes. So considering that thought and transitioning into what Maureen just said, Patty, I wonder if you're able to help us understand, you know, there's a lot of disparate outcomes out there. Every educational provider has solved for the key formula or selected the sweet spot that really resonates with them, that helps provide the wonderful kind of outcomes presentations that they wind up submitting to us. And each one of those presentations are different. And many organizations also don't have specific requirements for how the outcomes should fit. For example, should they be into a specific template? For example, we don't at Genentech have that requirement. So how do you take all of these disparate outcomes reports and wind up putting them together in a sensible, organized way so that your stakeholders and you understand?
Well, that's the $50,000 question, or I could say $1 million question. So we did build an outcomes reconciliation component into our Polaris platform. And we did work with a provider to do that who had expertise in outcomes so that we would be able to better aggregate data across programs that had similarities. So we have one database where people go in and identify the different types of participants, and they use the same terminology. It's a drop-down base. So everybody has the same AMA database that they use for that specialty database. In addition, you know, we really look at a lot of things that I was taught from early on from Hillary at Sanofi, was to really look at the expertise of the hit rate, like how many of the right population and target audience did we get. And if there's a huge variation there that the grant, you know, may not have reached its population at all, why was that? Was that because they weren't interested? Was it because it wasn't a knowledge piece? You know, what was the discordance there between what they suspected that they could reach as participants and those that they did reach? And likewise, if it was targeted towards a certain healthcare professional audience and a different audience took this test, for example, at Astellas, we have regadenoson, which is a cardiac imaging drug. And so we were finding that many of our programs that had been out there on enduring capacity were being taken by emergency physicians. And so to us, that had not been a targeted audience in the past, but because they're interested in that area, we delved a little bit further into a needs assessment to figure out why they were interested in these programs and what exactly were their gaps. And that led us to a whole different venue and a different approach to looking at that particular use of cardiac imaging stress tests to do within the emergency room. So we've aggregated our data. We look at also, I think, and Maureen touched on this a bit, and did Griselda, that in order to, when you're approving programs, we really look at the cascade and the totality of all the programs that we've approved, and so that we don't approve this, you know, the same program over and over and over. But rather that there's synergy, but that there's breadth and there's depth to each of these educational activities. And so that we're trying to capture along that way how we can impact knowledge and confidence and performance long term.
That's great. Griselda, we heard about cascading and totality of programs and aggregating the data in order to suggest the most appropriate endpoint has been met. What do you do in order to collect the disparate outcomes that you receive, to put them together in a fashion that is that resonates with all the stakeholders that you present to?
Sure. So a lot of what Patty said is spot on for our group as well. We do utilize a grant management system that has a reporting capability. The challenge and the limitations of that system is that beyond levels 1 and 2, we're still having reports uploaded to the system with the data contained within it, and so levels 3 through 7 are still basically PowerPoint or PDF or whatever format the provider has submitted them in. So I do spend a significant amount of time looking at all the programs across a therapeutic area and trying to narrow it down to see which are the common questions that are being asked across the board, and how does that relate to the different audiences that are being targeted. I spend a lot of time looking at, when I'm looking at level 1 and 2 data, as far as who participated, which audiences understood the content best. Was it the audiences we expected? Was it our target audience, or was it a totally different audience who's involved in the clinical care team but was not the target of the education? Those types of things, the information that lives in the negative space, is a lot of what I use to help inform whether or not the strategy needs to be modified slightly or whether or not we're right on target. It's also what I use to provide feedback to the provider. So I often ask providers, give me everything. I know the reports can be long and lengthy and it can be arduous, but I'll say, send me your solid report with your summarized data, but then give me everything. Because ultimately, I want to look at how each group performed per question, per topic, and whether or not you truly aligned with what I see as, Moore's level 4 or 5. Potentially, maybe you teased out some level 6 or 7 that you didn't consider that to be level 6 or 7 data, or maybe you teased out some information that may lead to a discussion around level 6 or 7 data. I want to see all of it, and then I want to talk to you about it, because if you can't clearly communicate to me how you met the objectives and the goal, then I will have a very difficult time communicating to my internal team how you did that. And that's a key component for me. Being able to communicate with the provider is, I think, the best part of what I do.
I'm finding a common trend with you, Griselda, which I very much appreciate. The short, the sweet, the relevant. Tell me exactly what the point is here. If you can't communicate it, I can't communicate it. And I think that's so important for each one of us to remember. A flavor of that has been brought to the surface of everybody's participation here today. But I do think that what you said is very important, especially among the summarized way of looking at outcomes. Maureen. Yes, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Derek.
No, not a problem. I just wanted to jump in because there was actually a question from the audience that kind of relates exactly to that.
Let's get to it.
Someone's asking, what is a specific example of a short, sweet outcomes result you presented that resonated with a key internal stakeholder?
Was that specifically to Griselda or to anybody on the panel?
I think it was to everyone in the panel. They didn't specify an individual.
You want to go ahead and start, Griselda, and then maybe others can chip in as well?
Sure. So it caught me a little off guard, so let me think really quickly. So
Well, let me jump in again real quick, and I'll tell John I have one more question then as well when you have a good opportunity for that one.
Great.
So, okay.
So we work in the area of cardiorenal, specifically in the area of hyponatremia, and we received some feedback from an outcomes report that a particular audience group was very involved in the care of these patients who we had never previously targeted, specifically nurse practitioners and physician assistants. Because our therapy area is hospital-based, it really it has very little linkage to the primary care, family practice. Everything's really happening in the hospital. We hadn't really thought about the specific role of NPs and PAs in the community and how they're helping to manage patients post-discharge. And that type of information and feedback was provided to us in actually a survey that was contained within a needs assessment, and then a follow-on outcomes report helped to sort of validate that information, that they were very involved but had specific questions that pertain to their role in caring for the patients post-discharge. That actually led to us supporting an educational program targeted solely to NPs and PAs. And that was a significant change for us, and it became part of the overall strategy.
Great. Maureen, do you have anything to add to the short and sweet summarized version?
Yeah, well, I'll answer the short and sweet in addition to the question where I was actually going to say, remember my earlier comments about outcomes, and that I'm really looking for patient level outcomes. So for me, the short and sweet specific example in the area of vaccines. Projects that we're supporting are based on CDC guidances in terms of a certain patient population and whether or not they should be vaccinated. Many of the projects we're supporting, if you will, have as a primary endpoint increased vaccination rates. So the short, sweet, simple story for me is, what was your baseline pre-project and where are the patients at post-project? And if there's a positive delta there, then that's a good story. And I can take that back to a whole slew of individuals all the way up to the executive leadership team to showcase a project that, in fact, increased vaccination rates.
That's perfect. That's perfect. That's a great example. Patty, anything to add?
You know, I think just the cardiovascular example again, where we actually had a program that was an enduring component that was targeted both for the cardiovascular specialist, the cardiologist specialist, as well as general medicine and others that were in that setting. And there were very distinct scores that had huge deltas between the knowledge and the competencies of the specialists versus those just in general medicine or primary care. So that then helped us to understand that the primary care physician needed more knowledge in this area, whereas we'd really saturated or felt that the cardiologist had really maximized their knowledge and their ability to actually improve care within their competencies.
Great. You know, I think that there's a common theme here as well, and one of the things I can share that we try to consider when receiving outcomes reports are how are we able to address the gap that was identified in this specific disease area or therapeutic area. For example, if it's a knowledge-based gap, if there's knowledge acquisition that's needed as an endpoint, can we show that from the disparate reports that there's an average delta percentage of improved knowledge as a result of everything we supported? Can we show that there's an average percentage of improved competence if there's a competence gap? If there's a performance gap or a patient gap, do we have specific data that shows that there has been observed objective input into the gap shortening because of the education that we supported? So I see very much aligned formats here of how we try to bring what we have to the stakeholders in each one of our organizations. So thank you for sharing that information. Derek, if I'm not mistaken, you had said that there was another question. Would you like to ask that?
Sure, I do. And bear with me here because it's pretty long and it came in 3 sections, so it might
Okay. We will bear with you.
Right. When measuring outcomes at the levels of changes in clinician performance and patient outcomes, what kind of measures are desired? There is a lack of there's a lack of validated nationally accepted measures in some areas. Or such measures may exist but may not reflect the focus of the educational project. Can measures developed for the project purpose be sufficient? Can qualitative data be valuable in documenting higher level?
And this was specifically, I'm sorry, Derek, because there was a little bit of a lag. This was for patient-level outcomes?
Yes, it was both. It was clinician performance and patient outcomes.
Yeah, I thought that that's what you had said. And you know what's so interesting, and I promise everyone on this session this was not a planted question. This actually somewhat aligns nicely to one of the last questions I was going to ask, and I think I'm going to go ahead and jump to that and maybe start with Maureen here. The question was really around, are there ways outcomes data you receive help you to show the support and engagement and learning tactic, whatever that might be, has a direct impact on patient care? And you've talked a lot about the fact that patient-level outcomes are truly what outcomes mean to you and what your stakeholders are interested in. So going a little bit beyond that and kind of merging the question with the question we just received from the audience, there is no such standard for patient-level effectiveness scores or patient-level outcomes. What do you do to show that the education you supported was effective in the patient world?
So, all right, I'm trying to get my thoughts together because I want to address something specific that was in the question, that there may be measures, but the education wasn't designed to meet that endpoint. And I my answer to that, or my response to that, is, well, then I wonder why you did the education in the first place. If at the end of the day your ultimate goal is truly to impact patient care, and I know that this is not as simple as I try to make it, but I do try to make it simple, at least in terms, the execution is the difficult part, but in terms of explaining, what is the problem we're trying to solve for through our efforts. I split it out between knowledge gap and practice gap. Okay, practice gap is a direct, potentially directly aligned to a patient outcome. If diabetic patients are not being managed appropriately, there's a gap in practice. Does that mean that the healthcare professional or the care team doesn't understand diabetes and doesn't understand the hemoglobin A1C? Measures and so on and so forth? Not necessarily. Perhaps there are other issues at play there, but that practice gap strategy, which oftentimes is going to include education, probably has to include other things to address barriers, to address the patient piece and non-compliance or adherence, etc. So this notion of how do you show supported engagement, and how, that your comment about there aren't any common, when we say patient outcomes, it's not like you can go Google it and say, okay, well, that's how you measure that.
Right.
You start with the problem and work backwards from there. What is the issue? Again, I'll use the lung cancer one, and I want to make sure I reinforce that it is my belief, and I'm willing to have that debate with anybody who wants to debate it, but I do not believe, when you're talking about the patient-level outcomes that we've all been throwing around out there, that education alone will ever get you to those measurable outcomes. I think the biggest disservice that the CME community and CE community has done to itself over the last 50-some-odd years is focusing entirely on education in a vacuum, and in some respects believing that it's someone else's job to help healthcare professionals translate knowledge into practice. And I would argue, guess what, guys? That's our job as a CPD profession. And the same strategies that you use to close a knowledge gap are very different than the strategies that you're going to use to close a gap in practice. And like I said, more often than not, that education plays a role in that, in terms of increasing awareness about things, putting a lot of data in front of individuals, but barriers, systems problems. I mean, this is why the Alliance has moved into, or trying to get all the collective of us to appreciate and understand our integrated role within the space of quality, because that's the connection there. That's okay, so we're educating, but you can't stop there. You have to understand how that education is integrated. And so I don't know that I'm answering your question, but I want to just focus on, there are measures coming out of our ears, rare disease and some other things, put aside, and I recognize that. In oncology, there are, that's ever changing, to Patty's point, but there are a whole lot of, measures through a variety of government entities, societies, and whatnot that you can tag onto, and you can design an entire change strategy around how to actually get to that measure, if in fact that's what is represented in your patient and subsequently your healthcare professional population.
Yeah, really insightful. I want to take that a little bit further. Before I do so, Derek, I want to check on time. If I'm correct, it looks like we have about 5-6 minutes left.
Yeah, we have a hard stop at 1:55.
Sure, and I want to make sure that I considered some time in there too for people that may have asked additional questions.
I have one question in queue.
Okay, so we'll get to that in one moment. I promise you, everyone out in the audience world. But Griselda, if I could ask you, we talked about, or Maureen talked about, education is one of the conduits to helping reach some of those gaps, but it's not just education alone. I absolutely agree with that. Do you try to reflect that within the outcomes reports that you present? Do you see that in the outcomes reports that you present? And are there any specific unmet goals that we have not yet addressed that you use the outcomes reports to help you with? And Patty, I'm going to ask you the same question, so you can think about that as well.
Absolutely. So when I'm looking at outcomes reports, one of the things I typically do is when I have an opportunity to meet with the provider to discuss the data, one of the first things I usually get to is, okay, we went through what you've provided here. This looks good. That looks good. We already know education alone is inadequate to close some of these gaps. And oftentimes I'll say to them, maybe you've overreached a little bit. This is a system barrier, and education alone is not going to close it, but here's what you impacted within the system. So particularly when we do EHR or PI-related programs, oftentimes when there's a preceptorship program, I'm really excited about the data we get back for those because they specifically look at how did we impact the clinicians' learning and knowledge, their competency levels, and how did that translate directly to the patient. And here's the de-identified patient data that shows us that on these clinical measures, these patients have improved. And I think one point that I want to really make about those types of programs is that large N's are not of any importance, particularly to me, in those cases. I'm looking for has the data been validated, and has it been presented in the best way so that I can help ensure that that story gets told up the chain to the important people within my group. And
yeah,
so,
bringing us back full circle. I'm sorry I didn't mean to
absolutely.
interrupt, Griselda, but we talked about level 1 and 2 and whether or not they're relevant now, and I think that you just showed that in some cases, in many cases, the participation size is not necessarily the ultimate endpoint that you're trying to reach.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I'm sure Patty will be able to add to this, but the other thing I just want to say about how the information is presented and whether or not we've reached a patient-level outcome, I am realistic about my expectations for an educational program. If you come to me with a level 6, level 7 program, you better believe the level of scrutiny is going to be incredibly heightened.
Sure, and it should be.
Exactly, but also I'm going to talk to you about it first. I'm going to RFI the heck out of that proposal, and I may get you on the phone and ask you some very compliant questions about whether or not this is achievable. Because beginning with the end in mind means that if this is what you're trying to achieve, I'm going to take you right to the end and backward to ensure that you're really going to be able to accomplish what you say.
Sure.
And then again, having realistic expectations, I think, is incredibly important.
Sure. Patty, in just the next 36 to 60 seconds, anything to add to all of this great information?
No, my colleagues have done an excellent job of explaining both their philosophies and their approaches. But the one thing I'd like to add is that I think that, as Maureen's pointed out about, we've taken education and sort of made it its own entity, and it can't be. But within that realm as well, we've taken knowledge and only generally do activities, many of the activities, relate to science knowledge and to data knowledge. But what I believe is extremely important is that where that patient fits in within that continuum of knowledge is also important to bring into these educational activities from square one. Thinking of a patient that you saw in clinic yesterday, how does the data you're getting today make a difference? What is it doing? So that patient centricity, without being really patient education or patient focused, but really thinking about where does science and the patient and the movement towards improved health fit together and become integrated from an interprofessional perspective.
I think that's great. The learning continuum is something that we must focus on because unless we want to try to initiate change, we need to know where the learners are on that learning continuum. So great point. Derek, do you want to go ahead and ask us the last question?
Yes, and it's for Maureen, and you have 30 seconds.
Okay.
In Maureen's example about patient-level data and increasing vaccination rates, is she okay with self-reported physician data that have increased vaccinated children, or are you looking for specific chart-level or EMR-level data showing more patients received XYZ vaccine?
Yep. Thank you for the question. And yes, we are only interested in the latter. We are not looking for self-reported data or intent to change data. The level, and that's clearly written in the request for proposals that we've published. We are looking for validated patient-level data. It doesn't, de-identified or even aggregated. It doesn't matter to me in that respect. This is the provider's project. But that's the expectation on our part. We are not looking at self-report anymore.
Well, I want to take this opportunity to thank Maureen, to thank Griselda, to thank Patty. When I had the opportunity to serve as a moderator for a panel like this, and I was told that these three ladies were willing to be on the panel with me, I was honored, and I knew that I would be surrounded by some great expert knowledge and feedback. So thank you so much for your participation. We hope that this has been incredibly helpful for all of those who are listening. Derek, I'm not sure if there's any closing remarks that you need to make.
I'm just going to say thank you all for joining us, and to remind everyone who's on this one that once we close out, which will be in 10 seconds, about 5 minutes, the next session will start, Tech Tools That We Can't Live Without. All you have to do is refresh your screen and start up the video. Thanks all of you very much. I really appreciate it, and we will talk soon.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Alrighty.
everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.